I will stay with her.
A Ghost Story for Christmas by C.O. Ebert.
Read by Wilbur-Friesman, Durst
and Elspeth Sauer. Introduction. Christmas Eve. It was the snow that delayed me. Not the theatrical kind that transforms a landscape into something fit for a card or a hymn, but a persistent, muffling fall that altered distances and dulled intention. Trains slowed, then stopped altogether. Roads became tentative suggestions rather than assurances. By late afternoon it was clear that I would not reach my destination, and equally clear that the countryside through which I had been carried without thought now required my attention. The inn was the only one open for miles. That, at least, was how it presented itself. A low, square building of stone and timber, its windows already lit against the early dark, smoke rising steadily from its chimneys as though it had been expecting travellers all day. There was no charm to it beyond utility, and perhaps that was its greatest kindness. Inside, the air was warm and faintly scented with pine and damp wool. A small fire burned in the hearth, not ostentatiously, but with a competence that suggested long practice. 3 other guests had arrived before me, all delayed by the same conditions, all resigned to the fact with varying degrees of good humour. We were strangers bound by inconvenience, which is often a more reliable bond than choice. It was Christmas Eve. This fact announced itself not through decoration so much as through restraint. A single sprig of holly had been fixed above the mantel. A bowl of oranges sat on a side table, their scent sharp and welcome. There was no music, no attempt at cheer, only the quiet understanding that this was a night people usually spent elsewhere, and that its meaning, such as it was, would have to be carried inward. We ate together, because there was nowhere else to go. Conversation began politely, and stalled quickly, as it tends to do when no one wishes to intrude upon another's private disappointment. Outside, the snow continued to fall, softening the world into abstraction. The windows reflected the room back at itself, doubling the firelight, the faces, the sense of enclosure. It was then that the older man spoke. He had been sitting slightly apart from the rest of us, close enough to the fire to benefit from it, far enough away to suggest independence. He was not old in years, perhaps, but he carried himself with a deliberation that implied long acquaintance with memory. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, but not tentative.
Christmas,
he said almost to himself,
is a peculiar time to be stranded.
Someone laughed politely. Another murmured agreement.
It insists on meaning,
he went on,
even when circumstances do not cooperate.
I found myself watching him more closely. There was nothing attention-seeking in his manner. He did not wait for encouragement.
People think ghost stories belong to Christmas because of superstition,
he said.
But that's not it. They belong because this is the time when absence is most sharply felt. Chairs empty, voices unaccounted for.
The room had grown quieter. Even the fire seemed to listen.
I once knew a man,
he continued,
who disappeared in Wales.
No one interrupted him. The snow tapped softly at the windows, as though asking admission.
I was there,
he said,
and I have spent every Christmas since then wondering whether he was lost, or whether he found exactly what he was looking for.
He looked up then, meeting our eyes one by one, not dramatically, but with a plain expectancy.
If you're willing,
he said.
I can tell you what happened. It's a long story, and it requires patience.
No one objected. Outside, the snow fell on, covering roads, fields, and paths alike, making all journeys provisional. The fire settled, the wind hummed softly, and the man began.
Part 1. It is a curious thing, and perhaps not accidental, that certain places in Wales keep their old stories as a man keeps scars, not paraded, not denied, but there, waiting for the light to strike them at the right angle. You may walk a lane between hedges, thick with bramble and the pale, sweet scent of crushed fern, and see only a quiet farm, a chapel with a leaning wall, a slate roof fretted with lichen. Yet let the evening mist gather, let the sheep's bells fall silent, let the wind turn and come down from the higher ground with a wet softness on it, and you will feel, if you are susceptible, the faint pressure of other presences, as though the land itself were listening for a name that has not been spoken loudly in a century. I am not Welsh. My blood is stubbornly English, and if I have any claim to intimacy with Wales, it is only that, as a boy, I was sent for a season to an aunt who lived near the border, and that later I wandered that country on foot, with the greedy restlessness of youth. I learned enough of the language to ask for bread and directions and to embarrass myself in villages, and I learned enough of the older people to know when they were humouring me, and when, quite suddenly, they were not. It was during that boyhood season that I first heard the story, and though I was then too young to understand why it lodged so deeply in the mind, it returned to me years later with a dreadful punctuality, as if it had been waiting for its appointed hour. My aunt's house stood a little above a river, in a place of folded green and stone walls where the rain seemed to arrive not as weather, but as a habit of the sky. Beyond her garden there was a track that climbed between hawthorn and gorse toward the higher slopes. If you followed it far enough, you came to open ground where the heather began, and the wind had a freer voice. One afternoon, when I had slipped away from the house with the shameless selfishness of a boy intent on adventure, I climbed higher than I had been told to climb, and found myself on a ridge looking down into a small, cupped valley that didn't appear on my aunt's careless mental map. It was not a grand valley. It held no lake that flashed like a coin, no waterfall to impress the visitor. It was simply a hollow of grass and stone with a few scattered rowan trees, their berries like drops of blood, and at its centre a darker patch that might have been a bog or a pool. A shepherd was there, sitting on a stone with his crook across his knees. His sheep moved slowly as if the very grass were heavy with moisture. He was an old man, his face browned and creased like a weathered apple. And he watched me approach with the mild interest one gives to a strayed dog. "Good afternoon," I said, with the exaggerated politeness of a child who knows he is trespassing. He nodded once. I asked him, pointing with the foolish confidence of youth, what lay in the hollow below. He followed my gesture without turning his head, his eyes resting on the darker patch at the centre of the valley. "That," he said, "that is where you do not go in the evening." It was not said sharply nor as a threat. It was said as one states a rule that does not require explanation, like not stepping under a ladder or touching a stove that is hot. "Why?" I asked at once. The shepherd shifted slightly on his stone. For a moment I thought he would ignore me. Then he spat into the grass and said, "Because she waits there." I remember the faint thrill that ran through me at the word. Children are shameless in their hunger for such things. "Who?" I demanded. He glanced at me then, and for the first time I saw something change in his expression. It was not fear. It was a sort of guardedness, as if he were measuring how much of the truth I could be trusted not to misuse. "The lonely one," he said at last, "the woman in the hollow." I laughed to show I was not frightened, though I felt a tightening in the chest that had nothing to do with mirth. "Is she a ghost?" I asked. He shrugged. She was a woman, he said. That is what matters. And now? And now she waits. I pressed him then, as boys do, with questions tumbling over one another. Had she drowned? Had she been murdered? Did she call to people? Did anyone ever see her clearly? To all of this, he gave answers that were not answers. Yes, men had gone down there and not come back. Yes, sometimes there were voices in the mist, though whether they were voices or only the sound of water moving in the grass was a matter of opinion. No, she did not walk the roads or come to the houses. She stayed where she was. "What does she want?" I asked finally. The shepherd looked back at the hollow. "She wants company," he said. It was the way he said it that troubled me later when I thought of it again. There was no relish in it, no satisfaction at the thought of danger. There was only a tired certainty, as though he were speaking of rain. I left him then, a little subdued, and went back down the track to my aunt's house. That evening, as dusk gathered early and the river darkened, I mentioned the valley and the shepherd's story, expecting laughter. My aunt did not laugh. "You ran upon old Evans," she simply said, naming the shepherd. She pursed her lips and said only, "You were too high up." That was all. The subject was closed. In the years that followed, I forgot the shepherd's face and the exact shape of the valley. The story sank into that part of the mind where half-remembered things lie, ready to rise again when stirred by chance or necessity. I might never have thought of it again at all had it not been for Jonathan Hale. Part 2. I did not think of that valley again for many years. Childhood has a way of sealing certain impressions away, not because they lack force, but because they arrive before one has the equipment to make sense of them. Wales remained, for a long time, a name rather than a place, a fold of green beyond the border, rain, stone walls, the smell of sheep and damp wool. The story, if it survived at all, did so in a softened form, no more than a caution vaguely remembered, like being told not to swim too far from shore. Jonathan Hale belonged to a later and altogether different chapter of my life. We went up to Oxford in the same year, though to different colleges, and met as young men often do, without ceremony or significance. A mutual acquaintance brought him to my rooms one evening, and he stayed because the fire was lit and the argument tolerable. He was American and carried that fact lightly, without either apology or display. There was money behind him, certainly, but it had been worn smooth by familiarity. What struck one first was not ease, but attentiveness. Hale listened closely, and when he spoke it was with the air of a man continuing a thought, rather than beginning one. At first I found him faintly irritating. He had a habit of smiling at the wrong moment, as if amused by implications others had missed. But irritation gave way, as it often does, to curiosity, and curiosity to something like respect. Hale had an orderly mind, but not a rigid one. He was interested less in systems than in what happened to people when systems failed them. He read history, but not as a catalogue of dates and victories. He was drawn to moments of displacement, men caught between old orders and new, individuals who survived not by triumph, but by accommodation. I remember him saying once, after a particularly heated discussion, that the true terror of history was not cruelty but superfluity. People endure pain, he said. What they cannot endure is finding themselves unnecessary. At the time, I took this for cleverness. Later, I recognized it as confession. We were friends, though not inseparable. We walked often, argued frequently, and shared long stretches of silence without discomfort. Hale had a capacity for stillness that I envied. When he read, the world seemed to retreat politely. When he considered a problem, it was with the patience of a man prepared to wait for the answer. It was during our second year that he met Eleanor. I did not meet her until much later, but her presence announced itself quickly in the small changes that betray importance. Hale spoke of her without flourish, but often. She was English, from a family with roots that gave her an unthinking sense of belonging. She read modern languages. She was, he said, precise. "She won't let me take refuge in vagueness," he remarked once with a smile that was not entirely humorous. For a time they seemed, from the outside, well matched. Hale's restlessness quieted. His talk of irrelevance diminished. He began to speak of plans, of possible futures, spoken not as abstractions but as choices. Then, without drama, her name disappeared from his conversation. At first I assumed discretion. Then I noticed the small signs that speak more loudly than declarations, the way Hale structured his days with unnecessary care, the manner in which he avoided certain streets in the city, the slight tightening about the eyes when he was asked even casual questions about his life. When I pressed him gently at first, he deflected. The truth emerged only gradually and without narrative shape. Eleanor had left him. There had been no great betrayal, no scene that could be rehearsed and mastered. She had simply withdrawn decisively and made it clear that she would not be returning. "She doesn't need me," Hale said once, not bitterly but with an odd clarity. "That's the whole thing. She never did." What frightened me was not the statement but the calm with which it was made. It was as though a conclusion had been reached and accepted, and all that remained was to live in accordance with it. After Oxford we drifted, as friends do. I remained in England. Hale travelled. He wrote from time to time, letters thoughtful but restrained, as though he were reporting rather than confiding. There was no mention of Eleanor. There was no mention of any other attachment. His letters spoke instead of places, of walking, of weather. Then, one morning in early autumn, a telegram arrived. It was brief, impersonal, and unnecessarily formal. "In England, stop, would like to see you, stop, Jonathan Hale." There was no address. Hale had always assumed, perhaps correctly, that such details could be managed by others. We met 2 days later in London, in a small cafe off Bloomsbury that had changed just enough to be disappointing. Hale was already there when I arrived, seated at a corner table with his hat beside him. He looked altered. It was not age, exactly. It was as though something had been thinned out of him, leaving the structure intact, but the substance reduced. He rose, smiled, and shook my hand. "You're well," he said. "You're thinner," I replied before I could stop myself. He laughed lightly. "Travel," he said. "It simplifies." We spoke at first of trivial things, the journey, acquaintances, the city. It was only after a second cup of coffee that the conversation faltered, as if both of us were aware of something that had not yet been named. "I don't want to go back to America," Hale said suddenly. I nodded. That did not surprise me. "I thought I might go somewhere quieter," he continued. "Somewhere older." The word caught my attention. "You mean the country?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "Not England, or not only England." There was a pause. Outside, the light had begun to flatten, the city preparing itself for evening. "You once spent time in Wales," Hale said, not as a question. "Yes," I replied, "as a boy, and later walking." "What's it like?" he asked. I hesitated. It seemed suddenly important to answer honestly. "Patient," I said after a moment. "Unobliging. It doesn't hurry to meet you." He considered this for a moment. "That sounds right," he said quietly. "It was I who suggested we go there, not at once, and not with any sense of urgency. I spoke of hills and small villages, of places where one could walk for hours without encountering another person, of the particular silence that gathers at dusk, in certain valleys. I didn't speak of the hollow, I didn't speak of the woman. Hale listened without comment. "Yes," he said finally, "that might do." Outside, the city lamps flickered on, one by one. Hale put on his hat. "Will you come?" he asked. I thought inexplicably of old Evans, the shepherd, sitting on a stone, of a darker patch in a valley, of a word spoken without emphasis. "Yes," I said, "for a time." Part 3. We did not go to Wales at once. There is always before such a journey a period of delay that later seems either providential or foolish. In our case, it took the form of a fortnight spent in England, Hale attending to matters he described vaguely as tidying up, and I arranging my own affairs with an absent-minded thoroughness that suggested I was preparing for something longer than I admitted to myself. During that time, I saw Hale often. We walked through the parks in the afternoons and sat in public houses in the evenings talking around subjects rather than into them. He spoke little of America and nothing at all of Eleanor. He did not appear depressed in any conventional sense. If anything, there was a lightness about him that was new, as though a burden had been set down. Yet the lightness was oddly inert. He was not animated by it. It was the lightness of a man who has ceased to brace himself. When at last we went west, we did so without ceremony. A morning train carried us out of the city through suburbs that thinned into fields, then into country that grew steadily rougher and more irregular. Hale watched from the window with a mild, attentive interest, remarking now and then on a church tower or a stretch of river, but mostly content to let the landscape pass without comment. We crossed the border almost without noticing. There was no gate, no announcement worth the name. The fields altered subtly. Stone walls replaced hedges. The land began to fold in on itself, hills rising where one expected only gentle slopes. The sky seemed lower. By the time we left the train and took to the road again, the air had acquired that faint, persistent dampness I remembered from childhood. Not enough to be called rain, but sufficient to remind one of its likelihood. Hale drew a long breath. "This is better," he said, as if to himself. We lodged at first in a small village whose name I will not set down. There was nothing remarkable about it. A handful of cottages, a chapel, an inn that served plain food without enthusiasm. The sort of place one might pass through without ever thinking of again. That, I think now, was its virtue. Our rooms looked out onto a sloping field where sheep grazed with an air of mild reproach, as though we had interrupted something. In the evenings, the light faded early, and a silence settled that was not oppressive, but expectant, as if the land were pausing between breaths. For several days, nothing happened. We walked. We ate. We slept. Hale seemed content to fill his time with movement, covering long distances at an unhurried pace, stopping often to look at nothing in particular. He spoke more freely than he had in London, though not of anything personal. He commented on the way the paths curved unexpectedly, on the sound of water moving unseen, on the odd sense one had of being watched without menace. "It doesn't press," he said once, gesturing vaguely at the hills. "That's what I like. It doesn't demand." I agreed, though I was less certain than he appeared to be. The villagers were courteous in a distant way. They answered questions when asked, but rarely volunteered information. Their English, when they chose to use it, was careful and precise, as if they were aware of its weight. More often they spoke Welsh among themselves, a language that flowed around us like water around stones. In the evenings, Hale sat by the fire in the inn and read or stared into the flames with an expression that was neither troubled nor serene. Once, as I watched him from across the room, I had the fleeting impression that he was listening to something I could not hear. When I asked him what he was thinking of, he smiled. "Nothing," he said. "That's the point." I slept poorly at first, not from fear, but from an old, half-forgotten alertness, as though my body remembered something my mind did not. The nights were very dark. When I woke, the silence pressed close, broken only by the occasional sound of water in a ditch or the movement of sheep beyond the window. It was on one of our longer walks, several days after our arrival, that I first felt the faint stirring of memory. We had followed a track that climbed steadily away from the village, passing between fields and then into rougher ground where gorse and heather began to assert themselves. The weather was clear, the air sharp enough to brighten the senses. From a rise, we looked down into a shallow valley, green and unremarkable, and for a moment I experienced a curious tightening in the chest, a sense of recognition without image. "Do you mind if we turn back?" I said abruptly. Hale looked at me surprised. "Of course not," he said. "But why?" "I don't know," I replied, irritated by my own vagueness. "I've had enough for today." He accepted this without comment, and we retraced our steps. The feeling subsided, leaving behind only a faint unease that I could not have explained even to myself. That evening, over a meal of indifferent stew, Hale spoke for the first time of his restlessness. "It's strange," he said thoughtfully. "I thought coming here would make me want to move less, but I find myself wanting to walk at odd hours, early, late." "Walking is harmless enough," I said. "Yes," he agreed, "harmless." He did not elaborate, and I did not press him. Days passed in this manner. The calm was almost excessive, as if the country were deliberately withholding something. I found myself thinking, with a faint embarrassment, of the shepherd and his valley, of the way he had spoken of waiting. I told myself that this was nonsense, the mind-imposing pattern where none existed. It was not until we had been in Wales for nearly a fortnight that the subject arose at all, and even then obliquely. We were returning to the village at dusk, the light already thinning, when Hale paused on the track and looked down into a low-lying area where mist had begun to gather. "People disappear here, don't they?" he said casually. The question startled me. "People disappear everywhere," I replied too quickly. He smiled slightly. "Yes, but here it feels quieter." I considered denying it. Instead, I said, "There are places people avoid." "Because they're dangerous?" he asked. "Because they're old," I said. "And people don't like old things when they stop being useful." He nodded, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. That night, I dreamed of a hollow cupped in green, and of a figure standing at its center, waiting with an infinite patience that was neither kind nor cruel. I woke before dawn, uneasy but not frightened, with the peculiar sense that the dream had not been entirely my own. The next morning Hale suggested another walk. This time I did not refuse. Part 4. We took a different direction the next morning, skirting the higher ground rather than climbing it. The sky was low, a pale, unbroken grey that made distances deceptive. Sound carried oddly in that light. The call of a bird seemed closer than it was, and our own footsteps sometimes echoed back to us from places that did not appear to exist. Hale walked a little ahead of me, hands clasped behind his back, his pace steady but unhurried. There was nothing furtive in him. If anything, he seemed more at ease than I had seen him for years. It was this ease, rather than any sign of agitation, that unsettled me. We passed a small farm where an elderly woman stood in the doorway watching us go by. She did not smile or frown, merely observed, as one observes the weather. When we had gone some distance, Hale glanced back. "She knows who we are," he said. "Everyone knows who strangers are," I replied. "Yes," he said, "but she knows what we're doing." "What do you think we're doing?" I asked. He considered. "Listening," he said at last. The path narrowed and dipped. Water ran somewhere beneath the grass, unseen but constant. I felt again that faint constriction in the chest, not sharp enough to be fear, but persistent enough to command attention. The land here wasn't dramatic. That perhaps was its strength. Nothing declared itself. Everything waited. We rested at midday on a low rise, eating bread and cheese from our packs. Hale lay back on the grass and stared up at the sky. "I used to think," he said suddenly, "that when something ended, it left a gap, a hole. But it doesn't. It leaves continuity. Everything goes on exactly as before, only without you in it." I said nothing. He was not asking for reassurance. "In England," he went on, "there are too many things that insist on going on with you. Clubs, dinners, obligations, even solitude is organized." "And here?" I prompted. He smiled faintly. "Here, solitude seems acceptable." I wanted to argue with that. I wanted to say that solitude is never acceptable, only endured. But the words felt thin, and I let them go. That afternoon the weather turned. A fine rain began to fall, not enough to soak us, but sufficient to blur the edges of the world. The hills withdrew behind a veil, the paths darkened. Hale appeared invigorated by it, lengthening his stride, breathing deeply. We returned to the village later than intended, the lamps already lit in the inn. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of freshly lit fire. A handful of locals sat at the bar, speaking quietly among themselves. As Hale and I took our seats, the conversation faltered, then resumed at a lower pitch. It was not hostile. It was simply attentive. An old man at the end of the bar glanced at Hale, then at me, and said something in Welsh to the landlord. The landlord nodded and wiped his hands on a cloth. "You're walking far," he said to us. "Yes," I replied. "We like it." The landlord hesitated, then said, "There are paths that look the same at all hours, but they are not." I smiled, hoping to signal appreciation without encouraging elaboration. "We're careful," I said. He accepted this with a nod and moved away. Later, as we sat by the fire, Hale leaned toward me. "They think it's dangerous," he said quietly. "What?" I asked. "The walking," he replied, "or rather, the walking at certain times." "Old habits," I said. "Every place has them." "Yes," he agreed, "but habits usually grow out of something." That night Hale did not sleep. I know this because I woke before dawn and found his bed empty. For a moment I lay still, listening, my heart beating faster than reason required. Then I heard the door below open and close softly. I dressed quickly and went down. The innkeeper looked up as I entered the common room. "Your friend's gone out," he said. "So I see," I replied, forcing calm into my voice. "Which way did he go?" The innkeeper paused, then jerked his head toward the road that led away from the village and into the lower ground. "He'll come back," he said, as if repeating something he had been told. "I hope so," I said, and went out into the grey. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with moisture. Mist lay in the hollows, pooling where the land dipped. I followed Hale's tracks easily at first, then with increasing difficulty as the ground softened. I found him at the edge of a shallow valley I did not recognize, standing very still. "Hale!" I called. He turned, startled, as if he had forgotten I existed. "I didn't mean to wake you," he said. "What are you doing?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "Walking," he replied. "Listening." "To what?" He looked past me, down into the mist. "It's difficult to say," he said, not a voice, more like the absence of one. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp. "This isn't wise," I said. "You don't know this ground." He smiled at me then, and for the first time I saw something like pity in his expression. "Neither do you," he said gently. I took his arm and steered him back toward the village. He did not resist. He did not argue. That, more than anything, alarmed me. For the rest of that day he was quiet, subdued, as if conserving energy. He ate little. He spoke only when spoken to. In the evening he sat by the fire and watched the flames with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. I found myself thinking again of the valley of my boyhood, of the darker patch at its center. I told myself that Wales was full of valleys, that memory was unreliable, that coincidence was not causation. Yet when Hale rose abruptly and said, "Let's walk," and when I saw that dusk had already begun to gather at the windows, my heart sank with a certainty I could not justify. "Yes," I said after a moment. "All right." Outside, the mist was already thickening. Part 5. We did not go far at first, that is worth saying, because later memory has a way of compressing distance, of turning a measured walk into a headlong rush. In truth, we moved slowly, almost aimlessly, along a path that followed the lower ground without committing itself to any particular destination. The mist had thickened, but not to the point of blindness. It softened rather than obscured, rounding edges, dulling contrast, making the world feel closer and more enclosed. Hale walked beside me now, no longer ahead. He did not speak. I did not press him. There was between us an unspoken agreement that whatever had drawn him out that morning had not exhausted itself. The path dipped gently and then rose again. We passed a stand of rowan trees, their berries dark in the failing light. Somewhere water moved, unseen but persistent, a sound like quiet breathing. I found myself slowing without quite realizing it, my body responding to cues my mind had not yet articulated. "Hale," I said at last, "this is enough for tonight." He did not answer at once. When he did, his voice was level. "In a moment," he said. We rounded a slight bend and the land opened. I stopped without intending to. Before us lay a hollow of the sort that appears unremarkable until one is standing at its edge. It was shallow, cupped gently by the surrounding rise, and filled with grass that grew darker and thicker toward the center. A few scattered trees stood at its margins, their branches thin and motionless. Mist lay in the hollow like a held breath. At its center was a darker patch, not large, not dramatic, simply darker, as though the grass there had failed to thrive, or as though water lay just beneath the surface. I knew it then, not with the certainty of recognition, but with the sick, familiar tightening of something long forgotten being brought abruptly to the surface. This was not the valley of my boyhood. It was not the same place. Yet it was the same kind of place, and the distinction felt academic. Hale stood very still. "This is it," he said quietly. "It's a bog," I replied, more sharply than I intended. "There are dozens like it." "Yes," he said, "but not this one." I turned to him. "You don't know that," I said. "You've never been here before." He smiled faintly. "No," he said, "but she has." The pronoun struck me like a blow. "Who?" I demanded. He did not answer. Instead, he took a step forward. "Hale," I said, and caught his arm. He looked down at my hand, then back at me, not angrily, not even impatiently, but with a mild surprise, as though he had forgotten I might object. "You can't go down there," I said. "Not now, not in this light." "I'm not going far," he replied, "just to see." "That's what people always say," I snapped, and then immediately regretted the edge in my voice. Hale's expression softened. "I won't disappear," he said. "Not tonight." He eased his arm from my grasp and took another step. The ground near the edge of the hollow was firm enough, and I followed him despite myself, my heart beating harder now. The air in the hollow felt different, heavier, as though it resisted movement. The sound of water grew louder, though I still could not see it. Hale stopped a few paces in. "Do you feel it?" he asked. I did, though I did not want to admit it. There was a pressure there, subtle but undeniable, not against the skin, but against attention itself. The world seemed narrowed, focused inward. "I feel cold," I said. He smiled. "Yes?" He took another step. The ground shifted beneath his foot with a soft, treacherous give. "Hale!" I shouted. He froze, instinct overriding whatever else held him. For a moment neither of us moved. Then he shifted his weight slightly, testing the ground. Dark water welled up around his boot. His breath caught. "Careful," I said, forcing calm. "Slowly, come back." He looked down, then up at me. For the first time I saw doubt in his face. "I didn't think it was this close," he said. "Nothing here is what you think," I replied. He made to step back, but the ground resisted, clinging. His boot sank a little deeper. I grabbed his arm and pulled. The suction broke with a sound like a muffled sigh, and Hale stumbled back against me. We both nearly fell, and for a moment we stood clinging to each other, breathing hard. "There," I said hoarsely. "That's enough." Hale laughed then, a short, almost embarrassed sound. "Yes," he said. "You're right." We retreated together to firmer ground. The hollow seemed to recede as we did so, the mist lifting slightly, the pressure easing. Within a few minutes it looked no more than an ordinary dip in the land. Hale stood looking back at it, his expression unreadable. "She's patient," he said, more to himself than to me. I seized on the word. "You don't know anything about her," I said. "You're projecting. You're tired, that's all." He did not argue. "I won't go again," he said quietly. "Not without you." It was not reassurance, it was statement. We walked back to the village in silence. The lamps were lit when we arrived, the windows of the inn glowing warmly. Inside, the air was laced with hints of smoke and cooking. As we took off our coats, the landlord glanced at our boots. "You found soft ground," he said. "Yes," I replied. He nodded once. "It finds people," he said, and turned away. That night Hale slept, or appeared to. I lay awake for a long time, listening to the familiar sounds of the inn, my mind replaying the way the ground had shifted, the way Hale had said she without hesitation. I told myself that this had been the danger, that we had reached it, tested it, and turned back. I did not yet understand that such places do not reveal themselves all at once. They wait. Part 6. For a few days after that evening, the world seemed to right itself, and this, too, is worth recording, because it is easy, in retrospect, to imagine an unbroken descent, one strange moment leading inexorably to the next. In fact, there was an interval of calm so complete that I allowed myself to believe, briefly and foolishly, that whatever danger we had skirted had been satisfied by our caution. Hale was quieter, but in a way that no longer alarmed me. He slept through the nights. He ate with something like appetite. He spoke readily when spoken to, and even laughed once or twice, though the sound startled me by its rarity. If I watched him too closely, I could detect a certain inwardness, a habit of pausing before answering, as though he were consulting some internal measure. But this was subtle enough to be dismissed as introspection. We continued to walk, though I chose our routes more carefully, keeping to higher ground and avoiding hollows where mist gathered too readily. Hale did not object. Indeed, he appeared content to follow where I led. A reversal of roles that reassured me more than I cared to admit. The weather held. Days passed under a pale, shifting sky. The land revealed itself gradually, not through spectacle, but through repetition, the way paths curved to avoid unseen obstacles, the way streams cut narrow channels that one heard long before seeing, the way certain stones bore the marks of long handling. I began to feel, in my body, the difference between places that merely existed and places that remembered. It was during one of these quieter walks that Hale spoke again of Eleanor, not abruptly and not with any sign of distress. We were crossing a stretch of open ground where the grass lay flattened by recent rain, the hills rising gently on either side. He stopped to retie a bootlace and said without looking up, "I You used to think love was something you earned by persistence. I waited. I thought if you stayed long enough, listened hard enough, you became necessary, he went on. It never occurred to me that necessity might be irrelevant. I said, People leave for many reasons. Yes, he agreed, but the reason doesn't matter once the leaving is complete. There was no regret in this calculus, only a careful acceptance that chilled me more than anger would have done. That evening we sat in the common room of the inn, the fire low, the talk subdued. A man I had not seen before occupied a table near the door, nursing a drink and watching us with mild interest. He was not old, but his face had the prematurely weathered look common in that country, as though the wind had had a hand in shaping it. When Hale went to the bar, the man leaned toward me. "You're not from here," he said, purely as statement. "No," I replied. "And your friend neither," he added. "That's right." He nodded, as if this confirmed something. "He walks late," the man said. I stiffened. "He enjoys walking." The man shrugged. "So do many. Not all come back." I forced a smile. "We've been careful." "Yes," he said, "for now." He did not elaborate, and when Hale returned, the man turned away, apparently uninterested. That night I dreamed again of the hollow, but differently. This time there was no figure at its center, only the sense of being expected, of arriving late to something that had been arranged without my knowledge. I woke with a start, my heart racing, and lay listening to the rain begin at last, steady and insistent. In the morning, Hale suggested a longer walk. "We could go further south," he said. "There's higher ground there." I hesitated, then agreed. There was no reason not to. The weather was clear again, the rain having washed the air clean. We set out after breakfast, following a path that rose gradually, giving us a broader view of the country than we had yet had. From the ridge, the land fell away in folds of green and grey, valleys opening and closing like slow breaths. Hale stood for a long time looking out over it, his face calm, almost contemplative. "It's generous," he said. "It gives you room." "Yes," I replied, "and takes it away again." He smiled slightly, but did not answer. We descended on the far side of the ridge into a region I did not recognize. The paths here were less distinct, more suggestions than directions. More than once we stopped to consult the map, only to find that it offered little help. The names it gave to features did not seem to correspond to anything we could see. "It doesn't mind being misread," Hale said, folding the map away. "That's another thing I like." I glanced at him sharply, but he was not looking at me. His attention was fixed on the land ahead, where the ground dipped into a long, shallow basin. Mist lay there, thin but persistent, clinging to the lower ground despite the sun. "Let's not go down there," I said at once. Hale turned to me surprised. "Why not?" "I don't like it," I replied, and heard with irritation how close this came to superstition. He studied the basin thoughtfully. "We don't have to," he said. "Not yet." The words were innocuous enough, yet something in their phrasing lodged in my mind. We skirted the basin instead, keeping to firmer ground. The walk tired me more than I expected, and by the time we turned back toward the village, the light was already beginning to fail. Hale appeared invigorated, his step lighter than it had been all day. That evening, as we approached the inn, he paused. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" I asked. "For pulling me back," he replied simply. I nodded, uncertain what response was required. "I said I won't go without you," he added. "I meant that." I believed him. It did not occur to me then that this promise did not preclude my being present when he chose not to return. Outside, the mist was gathering again, quietly, as it always did, as though answering some unspoken signal from the land. Part 7. After that there settled upon our days a rhythm so even that it lulled the senses. I do not mean that nothing happened. Things happened constantly, but they were small things, easily absorbed into the texture of ordinary living. We rose, we ate, we walked. We returned at dusk. We sat by the fire. The land altered subtly from hour to hour, light thickening or thinning, wind shifting its direction, water appearing where none had been before. If one were not attentive, it would have been possible to believe that we had simply become part of the place, that the place had accepted us on its own terms. Hale, in particular, appeared to have reached an accommodation. He no longer walked ahead of me, nor did he linger behind. He matched my pace without effort, stopping when I stopped, turning when I turned. There was something deliberate in this, but not strained. It was as though he had decided consciously and finally to relinquish urgency. I found myself watching him less, not because my unease had vanished, but because it had softened into a constant presence that no longer demanded immediate attention. One cannot remain indefinitely at the height of apprehension. The mind seeks equilibrium, even in the shadow of danger. It was during this interval that we began to speak more freely of trivial things. Hale told me in an offhand way about his family, about the peculiarities of his childhood, about the way his mother collected objects with no practical value and arranged them meticulously on shelves. He spoke of America as one might speak of a former residence, familiar but no longer inhabited. There was no longing in it. When I asked him whether he intended to return, he shrugged. "There's no urgency," he said. "That's what I've discovered. Most decisions feel urgent only because we're afraid not to make them." "And some decisions are urgent," I said. "Yes," he agreed, "but not many." I found myself thinking then that his calm was not the absence of disturbance, but a narrowing of focus. He had reduced the world to a manageable scale, excluding anything that did not bear directly upon his immediate experience. It was, in its way, admirable. It was also dangerous. One afternoon, as we sat on a low stone wall eating bread and cheese, a woman approached us along the path. She was middle-aged, dressed plainly, carrying a basket of apples. She greeted us politely and asked whether we were enjoying the weather. "Yes," I replied. She nodded, then looked at Hale. "You walk a great deal," she said. "So do you," he replied, smiling. She hesitated, then said, "Some walks are longer than they appear." It was said without emphasis, without menace. She did not wait for a response, but continued on her way, leaving us with the faint smell of apples and damp wool. "People here have a way of saying things," Hale observed. "Yes," I said. "They don't waste them." That evening I found myself telling Hale, at last, something of my boyhood in Wales. Not the story in full, not the hollow or the fragment of a tale given by old Evans the shepherd, but enough to suggest that the land carried memories that were not easily dislodged. "I don't think places forget," I said, choosing my words carefully. "They may be quiet, but that's not the same thing." Hale listened attentively. "Do you think they remember people?" he asked. "I think they remember events," I replied. "People are incidental." He considered this. "That would explain a great deal," he said. "I slept poorly that night, troubled by dreams that were not vivid enough to be called nightmares, but persistent enough to erode rest. I dreamed of paths that curved back on themselves, of hollows that were deeper than they appeared, of standing at the edge of something and knowing that the decision had already been made elsewhere. In the morning, Hale was gone again. This time I was not startled. I lay for a moment listening to the silence, then rose and dressed with a care that suggested resignation rather than alarm. The innkeeper was awake, wiping the bar with a cloth. "He went early," he said. "Yes," I replied. "He'll come back," the innkeeper added with the same inflection as before. I nodded, though I no longer found the assurance comforting. I followed the road out of the village, then the path that led toward the lower ground. The air was cool, the sky pale and undecided. Mist lay thinly in the dips, lifting as the sun strengthened. I found Hale not in the hollow, but on the ridge above it. He was standing with his back to me, looking down. "Hale!" I called. He turned, unsurprised. "I thought you'd follow," he said. "You didn't wake me," I replied. "I didn't need to," he said. "You're listening now." I joined him at the ridge. From there the hollow lay below us, quiet, unremarkable, its darker centre barely visible in the morning light. "It looks different in daylight," I said. "Yes," he replied, "but it is the same." We stood there for a long time without speaking. "I won't go down," he said at last. "Not today." Relief washed through me, sharp and almost painful. "Thank you," I said. He smiled. "You're welcome," he replied. "It's important to learn how to wait." As we turned back toward the village, I told myself that this was progress, that whatever pull had drawn him toward the hollow was loosening, that patience was replacing impulse. I did not yet understand that patience was precisely what the place required. It had all the time in the world. Part 8. The days shortened. This was not at first apparent, because the weather remained mild, and the light, though altered, still carried warmth. Yet evening came a little sooner each night, and the moments of indistinction between day and dusk lengthened, as though the land were reluctant to surrender one state for another. Hale remarked on this once, without emphasis. "There's a generosity to the in-between," he said. "It doesn't ask you to choose." I did not answer. I had begun to distrust such observations, not because they were untrue, but because of the ease with which he accepted them. We continued to walk, though our routes narrowed by degrees. Paths we had taken earlier now seemed less inviting, either because the ground had softened or because something in me resisted them. I steered us toward higher places when I could, toward open views where the sky remained visible and the land declared itself honestly. Hale followed without protest. It was during one of these walks that we encountered Evans. He was mending a fence near a field boundary, his movements economical and practiced. I recognized him at once, though years had passed since I'd last seen him. The face had grown more lined, the hair more grey, but the set of the eyes was unchanged. I had a brief moment of amazement, as one does when they encounter an elder who was already old in their childhood, yet lives on still. I wondered when I saw him working nimbly if perhaps he was not so old as I had thought him to have been when I was a boy, or if he was just of hearty stock. "Good morning," I said, and he looked up sharply. For a moment he stared at me, then nodded. "You were a thin one," he said. "Once." "Yes," I replied, "I was." He turned his attention to Hale, studying him with an intensity that made me uneasy. "And this is yours?" he asked. "My friend?" I said. Evans nodded. "You walk," he said to Hale. "Yes," Hale replied. "I like it." Evans grunted. "Walking is honest," he said, "but it tells on you." He went back to his fence. Conversation apparently concluded. We moved on, but after a few paces, Hale slowed. "He knows," Hale said quietly. "He knows a great many things," I replied. That afternoon the weather changed decisively. The sky closed in, low and grey, and a fine rain began to fall, soaking the ground without drama. We returned early to the village and spent the remainder of the day indoors, the inn unusually quiet. It was then, with nothing to distract him, that Hale spoke again of Eleanor. "She used to say I listened too much," he said, gazing into the fire, "that I mistook attentiveness for understanding." "What did you say to that?" I asked. "That she was wrong," he replied. "I was listening for the wrong things." There was no bitterness in this, only reflection. "When she left," he went on, "it wasn't dramatic. She didn't accuse. She didn't explain herself at length. She simply said she had no place for me in the life she wanted. That happens, I said. Yes, he agreed, but it leaves a residue. It is not, he said after a pause, that her loss left me a shell. It did, at first, of course, but time passes. It is more what it exposed. She was astute. The eyes she saw me through were clear. She saw me as anyone who took the time to look and had the mind to comprehend me would. Incomplete. Not that I am incomplete, inherently, but I am incomplete and unnecessary for any place and time I have ever been in. It is true I have never been the same since she left, but not because she left, because of what in myself I cannot unsee, which she confirmed in observation. No, wait, that is not quite right. It is not that I have not been the same since, but rather I have reckoned finally, I suppose, with what I have always been. Incomplete, in process, and thus without utility, at least insofar as any experience I have ever had. He paused. I don't think she meant to be cruel, he added. I think she was simply precise. I found no reply to this. That night, long after the inn had fallen quiet, I woke to the sound of movement below. Not the door this time, but footsteps crossing the common room. I lay still, listening. The sound ceased. There was a pause, then the faint creak of the stairs. Hale stood in the doorway of our room. He did not look agitated. If anything, he looked composed. I'm going out, he said. I'll come with you, I replied at once, throwing off the covers. He hesitated. I'd rather you didn't, he said. That wasn't a request, I replied, already pulling on my coat. He studied me for a moment, then nodded. Very well, he said. But we won't go far. Outside, the rain had slackened to a mist that clung to everything. The village lay dark and silent behind us as we took the road that led toward the lower ground. Our footsteps sounded unnaturally loud. We walked without speaking. Hale's pace was steady, measured. He did not hurry. That again unsettled me more than haste would have done. After a time, the road gave way to a path, and the path to grass. The land dipped gently. Hale, I said quietly, this is enough. He stopped. Yes, he said. For tonight. Relief stirred in me, cautious and only partial. We stood there for a moment, the mist thick around us, the ground breathing softly beneath our feet. I won't go without you, he said again. I know, I replied, though the words had begun to lose their comfort. We turned back toward the village, and for a while the sound of water followed us, faint and persistent, like something keeping pace, just out of sight. Behind us, the mist closed gently over the path. It did not hurry. Neither, I realized with a quiet dread, did it need to. Part 9. After that night, the village itself seemed to alter its posture toward us. Nothing overt occurred. Doors did not close when we approached. Conversation did not cease abruptly. Yet there was a subtle shift, as though a margin of tolerance had been quietly reached and passed. People watched Hale more closely now, and me with a different, more appraising look, as though I had become not merely a companion, but a custodian. It was not hostility. It was assessment. Hale appeared not to notice, or if he did, he chose not to acknowledge it. His calm deepened, but it was no longer the placid calm of rest. It had acquired direction. He rose earlier. He lingered longer at thresholds. He paused at points in the landscape that seemed to me indistinguishable from any other, and stood there with an attentiveness that bordered on reverence. "You hear it too, don't you?" he asked me once, as we stood on a rise overlooking a shallow basin where mist lay even at midday. "I hear water," I replied. "Yes," he said, "and something else." I said nothing. That afternoon Evans came to the inn. He sat at the bar and drank without speaking for some time, his presence heavy but not intrusive. When Hale went to fetch more wood for the fire, Evans leaned toward me. "He's not sick," Evans said quietly. "No," I replied, "and he's not mad." "No." Evans nodded once. "Then he's chosen," he said. I felt a tightening in my chest. "Chosen what?" Evans did not answer immediately. He finished his drink, set the glass down with care. "You don't choose it," he said at last. "You choose whether you turn back." He stood and left without another word. That evening, Hale suggested we leave the village. "Just for a night," he said. "There's a place further on. We could stay there." "Why?" I asked. He considered. "Because I don't think this is where it happens." The phrasing chilled me. What happens?" I asked. He met my gaze steadily. "Whatever is waiting," he said. I should have refused. I knew that. The knowledge was clear and unambiguous, yet I found myself asking instead, "Where?" He described it vaguely. A farmhouse no longer worked, a place where rooms were let occasionally to walkers. It lay closer to the lower ground, nearer to the folds of land I had been careful to avoid. We set out the next morning under a sky that promised rain, but withheld it. The path took us away from the village and into country that felt less inhabited, though signs of past labor were everywhere. Collapsed walls, fields gone back to rough grass, the remains of tracks that led nowhere now. The farmhouse stood at the edge of a rise, its stone walls darkened by age and weather. A woman answered our knock, older than I expected, her face lined but her eyes sharp. She took us in without comment, showed us to our rooms, and asked no questions. That night the wind rose. It came down from the higher ground with a sound like distant surf, rattling the windows and worrying at the eaves. I lay awake, listening, aware of Hale's presence in the room beside mine, aware also of the space beyond the walls, of the land pressing close. Sometime after midnight I heard him move. I rose at once and opened my door. Hale stood in the passage, fully dressed, his coat over his arm. "I won't go far," he said. "I know," I replied, and followed him without further argument. Outside, the wind had slackened, leaving the world strangely still. The moon was hidden, but the light was sufficient to see by, a pale diffusion that flattened the landscape. We walked downhill. The ground grew softer beneath our feet. Water gleamed faintly in shallow channels. The land cupped itself around us, drawing us inward. "Hale," I said quietly, "this is where we turn back." He stopped. "Yes," he said, "this is the last place." I waited for him to elaborate. He did not. Instead, he looked at me with an expression I had not seen before. It was not calm nor resignation, but something like gratitude. "You don't have to come further," he said. "I'm already here," I replied. He nodded. We went on. The hollow emerged gradually, not as a sudden revelation, but as an accumulation of small signs. The way the ground sloped just a little too evenly, the way the grass darkened, the way sound diminished. Mist lay there, thicker now, its edges indistinct. At the center, the darker patch waited. Hale stopped at the edge. "This is where you stay," he said gently. "No," I replied at once. "Yes," he said, "because this is where I choose." I seized his arm. "You don't know what you're choosing," I said, my voice breaking despite myself. He did not pull away. "I know exactly what I'm choosing," he said. "I'm choosing not to go back to a life where I am surplus." The word struck me with its old, remembered force. "There are other ways," I said desperately. "Yes," he agreed, "but not for me." He eased his arm from my grasp and took a step forward. The ground accepted him, not greedily, not with haste. It yielded just enough. "Hale," I said, and my voice sounded small in the open air. He turned back to me one last time. "She's not cruel," he said. "She's alone. She needs me. She doesn't need just anyone. She needs me. Finally, specifically, me. And I go not because I must, but because I can. I listened, I attended, and for her, that is the company she needs. She is enough. I am enough. Together we are complementary and complete. Something shifted in the mist then. Not a form, not a figure, but a change in density, a subtle rearrangement of space. I felt, rather than saw, a presence that was neither hostile nor inviting. "You don't know what she is," I said. He replied calmly, "Yes, I do. She is a human being, and she is alone. But she doesn't have to be, not anymore, and I don't have to be alone and unneeded anymore either." "I will stay with her," Hale said clearly, knowingly. The words settled into the air with a terrible finality. He took another step. The mist closed around him. I lunged forward. But the ground at the edge of the hollow held firm beneath my feet, as though it had made its choice too. Hale did not cry out. He did not struggle. He simply went on, moving with a calm that was almost reverent, until the mist swallowed him entirely. I stood there for a long time, unable to move. At last, from within the mist, a voice spoke. It was not Hale's, nor was it phantasmal nor hollow. It was quiet, measured, and unmistakably human. A woman's voice.
"He is not taken. He has come to me. Someone finally chose to come."
Then the mist thinned, and the hollow lay empty. I do not remember how I returned to the farmhouse, or how I made my way back to the village, or how I left Wales. These things occurred, but without substance, like events recalled second-hand. What I remember is this: the land did not feel lighter afterward. It felt complete. Years later I returned once, briefly, to that country. I did not seek out the hollow. I did not need to. At dusk, walking a ridge far above it, I felt a warmth at my back, like the last light of day resting there a moment longer than expected. People still speak, I am told, of men who go walking and do not return. They speak of danger, of seduction, of loss. They are not entirely wrong, but they have mistaken the nature of the choice.
Coda, Christmas morning. When he finished, the fire had burned low. No one spoke at once. That too felt appropriate. The story had not ended in a way that invited comment, and any attempt to draw conclusions from it would have felt like an intrusion. Outside, the snow had slackened, leaving the world suspended in a quiet that was neither night nor morning. At last someone stirred, reaching for a cup that had long since gone cold. The small, ordinary sounds of movement returned. A chair shifting, a log settling in the grate. The spell, if there had been one, did not break so much as loosen its hold. The man who had told the story did not look at us expectantly. He seemed relieved, almost, to have set it down.
"I don't tell it often,"
he said, as though offering an explanation no one had asked for.
"Not because it frightens people, because they're too quick to decide what it means."
"But what does it mean?" one of the others asked gently. He considered this.
"I don't think it means anything,"
he said.
"Not in the way people usually want meaning. It isn't a warning exactly, or a consolation."
He stood and went to the window, looking out at the snow-brightened dark.
"At Christmas,"
he went on,
"we're encouraged to believe that all separations are temporary, that everyone belongs somewhere warm, somewhere remembered. It's a comforting idea, but it isn't always true."
He turned back to us then, and there was no sadness in his expression, only a sober kindness.
"Some people don't want to be gathered back into the world as it is,"
he said.
"Some people want to belong to something quieter, smaller, more exact."
No one contradicted him. Outside, a faint paling of the sky suggested that morning was approaching, tentative and cold. The storm had passed. Roads would reopen. Trains would run. We would all go on, carrying the night with us in different ways. As we rose to disperse, the man paused.
"For what it's worth,"
he said,
"I don't think he was taken.
He smiled briefly.
I think he was received."
He said nothing more after that. The fire had settled into a low, practical glow, doing only what was required of it. Someone added a log without comment. Outside, the snow had stopped entirely, leaving behind the faint, uncanny brightness that comes only after a night of steady falling. The world had been altered, but not dramatically. Edges were rounded, tracks were softened. Distances looked shorter than they truly were. When we parted, it was without ceremony. No one shook hands. No one thanked him. That too seemed right. Stories of that kind do not invite gratitude. By morning, the road was passable again, though not yet reliable. I set out early, my bag heavier than it had been the night before, though nothing had been added to it. The inn receded quickly behind me, becoming first a building, then a shape, then nothing at all. The countryside lay quiet under its new covering. Fences ran half-buried across fields. Trees stood with a kind of patient indifference, as though they had seen such mornings many times before. I walked carefully, aware of the way snow disguises depth, how a shallow drift may conceal something softer beneath. At one point the road dipped, and for a moment I found myself attentive in a way I had not been before. Not afraid, simply alert. I altered my course slightly, without conscious decision, favouring firmer ground. It occurred to me then that stories like the one I had heard do not linger because they frighten us, but because they recalibrate attention. They change how one walks, how one waits, how one understands the difference between being lost and having stopped. By the time I reached the station, the sun had cleared the low clouds, and the snow had begun its slow retreat from the roads. Trains were running again, cautiously, as if remembering an older instruction. I travelled on. The holiday passed, as holidays do. Decorations were taken down. Letters went unanswered. Chairs were filled or remained empty according to arrangements that had nothing to do with intention. But even now, when evening gathers early and the land grows indistinct at the edges, I sometimes recall that voice by the fire and the care with which the story had been set out to us, neither offered nor withdrawn. And when I walk, I find myself listening, not for voices, for places that have learned how to wait,